Well, things were a bit different from now, obviously. First of all, medicine had just, or was just, undergoing a huge change. If you look at medicine in, say, 1950, or especially 1940, and compare it with what it was when we were trying to deal with chronic renal failure in children, for example, there was huge changes. When you look at the introduction of pharmacological agents during the 50s and the early 60s, it's everything our daily bread, basically, in terms of medicines, came in, and we were able to treat things. It's difficult to remember. When I became a medical student, people died of malignant hypertension because there was no treatment for them. Okay, there had been low-salt diets, the rice diet that Kempner. He wrote very powerful, persuasive papers, but the patients couldn't take the diet, so it failed. But there were no pills at all that you could give to somebody with blood pressure that would save them from severe blood pressure. So, for example, a lot of children in renal failure got hypertension and they died of it. They had hemorrhages, strokes, or whatever. And that's something that's worth remembering. The lack of types of treatment, and then into that vacuum, as it were, came, first of all, acute dialysis, which saved roughly half the people who had acute renal failure. Dialysis actually was done quite early in children for acute renal failure, after it was introduced for adults in Kolff had his first success in 1945, and Alval and Murray in Canada in 1946. But the first child that I've been able to find was treated as early as 1950 in Boston, who was 6. That must have been quite a courageous thing to do, I know, because when we came to we didn't start dialysis until just after the early 60s, in fact, in adults. And inevitably, because at that point there was really no paediatric nephrology, I went off to the States for a year, because they were well ahead of us in most things. I wasn't involved in paediatrics, although I was in New York. I didn't meet Henry Barnett, for example, who was an absolutely crucial figure in the evolution of paediatric nephrology as a specialty, both internationally and nationally in the United States. And he was up in the Bronx, and I was down on the east side in Cornell, and he was in the Bronx, and I never met him. I probably was in the same room with him, because there was a group in New York, which was the Nephrosis Foundation. I don't know the history of it. It has been recorded, but I believe it was started by parents of children with the nephrotic syndrome. This is way back probably in the 40s, or certainly in the 50s, sometime in the 50s. And they had a regular meeting, and I went to some of those meetings, and that was my first encounter with the idea of sick children. And I was already interested in actually doing research in the nephrotic syndrome in adults. So obviously it was quite interesting. And I met a number of people, say Jack Metcalf, for example, which is probably a name you don't know, but he was a leading figure who sadly himself died on dialysis. In the early 60s, we were dialyzing adults, and naturally children occasionally were referred in acute renal failure, and older children were the only ones that were referred. I think the paediatricians reckoned that probably they shouldn't be doing this to a 3-year-old. But we did dialyze, without thinking too hard about it, children for acute renal failure. And by the time 1970 came around, already we had a sort of an organisation, we were organised to do that. And in fact, Roy Meadow wrote about that. There's a paper in the literature. Roy was then one of the registrars on the paediatric unit at Guy's at that time. So we slid into dialyzing acute renal failure. So we were not strangers to dialyzing older children. We used to use a twin coil and cut clamp off one coil and do them on a single coil, which was half the size. And that worked down, obviously down to about 20 kilos. That worked okay. And there was good volume control, which was one of the main problems in dialyzing children, was their tiny blood volume in relation to the dialyzer. And some people filled the circuit with compatible blood before they started, rather than bleeding off the patient into the... Because already many of them, of course, were very ill and very hypovolemic in any case, and very anemic. Anyway, so we slid into acute dialysis. So we already were familiar before Richard and came back from Africa, and with his biopsy needle, and set up the biopsy of a program in the southeast, and I helped with that, and then of course took it over for what was supposed to be a short while when he left, but turned out to be several long years. And during that time, Chisholm Ogg joined me as the second physician, having been our registrar. So both of us were looking after the children, along with the paediatricians. And I should mention them because Ronnie McKeith and Philip Evans had been two very influential tutors to us as medical students, both myself and Chisholm. And Chisholm actually he was a respectable paediatrician. He had a DCH. I didn't have anything. But I think my heart was in the right place as to how patients, especially young patients, should be managed. And with the help of the paediatricians, as I say, we got by. So chronic renal failure, when we started dialyzing chronically in 1966, I have a picture of myself with the first young man, 21-year-old, that we dialyzed, and that was when I realized that it was a contract for life. That was in August 1966. There was a reason for that, because money had become available to start up a few pioneer units, of which we were not one, had been doing chronic dialysis, long-term dialysis, after shunts were introduced. And all our early dialyses in children were done with fairly standard the smallest sized Teflon shunts that we could get. And then when fistulas came in, we started doing fistulas. But so, did we think about doing long-term dialysis in children? I have asked now 6 people, because my feeling was that it just again crept up on us. Because we were already dialyzing adults and looking after children, inevitably we ended up with some children with renal failure. And I asked Chisholm, just going through several of the nurses who were crucial, of course, in this enterprise, who had to set up new technology to do long-term dialysis in quite smaller and smaller children as we threw smaller and smaller children at them. So we moved from over 10-year-olds, down to 20 kilos, and then very few people in the world were attempting to dialyze chronically any child under 20 kilos at that time. So it was a rather bold step, and we did think hard about that transition. But at the beginning, it just happened. They were there, and they needed treatment, and then we had realized suddenly that we had half a dozen children on long-term dialysis, and we'd better start organizing a proper unit. And then Cyril came back and really got the show on the road, and so I gratefully handed over to him the care of the children we already had. And by that time we had specialist childhood nurses who were working with the children, and we had about a dozen children on long-term dialysis at that time, not as many as the French. In Europe, I think the French had really gone fastest into this. But again, most of their children were over 10. Our gear was pretty primitive for both the adults and the children at that time. Initially we were dialyzing on a twin coil and started chronically, but I went to Stanley Shalden's unit and got the Scribner type of dialysis with the equipment, with the flatbed dialyzers which you built. Building that kidney was just one of the most awful things. And nobody who has not built a keel would understand how bad it was, because you could sometimes build it 6 times and it would not be airtight at the end, and of course it had to be. You built a stack of plastic and membranes. But it was very useful because it meant having several membranes. You could easily create a dialyzer of 1, 2 or 3 or 4 units, which very nicely and immediately fitted in with doing dialysis in children, and adjust the dialyzer volume to the blood volume and the plasma volume of the children. We were frightened, I must admit, of doing the smaller children, and when some of them died, as they did, it was even more heartrending than the usual problems of dealing with our older patients. At that time, the shock of entering an adult dialysis unit was not nearly what it was later on, because most of the patients in the adults we had were young adults. Some of them were actually, came from pediatric units. They were in their teens, and others were in their 20s and 30s. There were very few. There wasn't the rows of elderly patients there are now. We hadn't realized or faced up to the fact that chronic renal failure in the population as a whole is a disease of old people. That was over the horizon. So the children were, in fact, in a group of young adults who shared a lot of the older kids, could fairly easily relate to them. So perhaps it wasn't such a damaging shock as it might have been. But we slid into childhood dialysis. We didn't slide into childhood transplantation, because we didn't ask if we could dialyze the children. We didn't tell anybody. We didn't publicize it until later, when we wrote the first cases up. But with transplantation, it was a bit more obvious. Well, bone disease, of course, was quite prominent in some of the patients to start with. We worried hugely about growth, and that was one of the reasons why Cyril Chandler went to Mac Holliday, who just died, sadly, the other month, last year, I think, sometime, because he at that time was the world expert on growth in children in renal failure. Everyone knew that children became stunted. No one was sure at all about whether you could cure this and how much you could cure it by high calorie intake, what you should do about the protein intake, high, medium, low. It was a hot topic because there were no data. So we worried a lot about the growth in the children, and the children, some of them were already quite stunted, and some of them did not grow, which was very worrying indeed. I mean, we were still struggling to solve that when Cyril came back, and we started a fairly intensive program of trying to improve growth in the children. Because when we wanted to transplant, we were told bluntly by other pediatricians and by people we talked to, you don't want to go there. You'll end up with a 25-year-old who's 3 foot high and stunted socially, sexually, metabolically, and you're going to regret you ever got into this. And that was quite a powerful feeling amongst the medical community. Of course, the parents, as usual, were exactly in the opposite camp. They wanted everything done for their child that could be done. And without them, we wouldn't have been able to do many of the things we did. We did, in fact, do home dialysis in children at that point. That was our main aim, was to get the children home. And we ran a program on that, but the analysis that Val Wass did, this was now into the 70s, showed that the effect on the families was so devastating, especially on siblings, with the invasion of the attention that this one sick member of the family was getting. And we felt really that home dialysis was something
we shouldn't be doing. I see, interestingly, that it's now being advocated again, but I shall watch how people do today. Technically it was a success. We made it happen. We made it work. The families could cope. They did needling, and we even had a few children who needled themselves. But the effect on the family was such that we felt we shouldn't proceed with it. And from then on we did, and you can talk to Cyril about this more than me, the hemodialysis was done essentially in the unit. Yeah, one thing we didn't do much about was we lived very much like Ivan Denisovich, if you remember, living from day to day. We took each day at a time, and we were glad to have done something new, saved another life or lives, which was the immense satisfaction. When we went home, we rarely got home. That was another problem that I have to mention, that the lives of the people looking after patients in long-term dialysis and transplantation overwhelmed their family life in a way that would not be permitted today, and I'm glad to say is gone. A lot of the marriages of the staff broke down because of this. It was because of overcommitment to this nascent program. So we thought we didn't. We obviously, I had started the dialysis unit and started the transplant unit as well at the same time, absolutely deliberately, because I set out in public and wrote letters to people and said there is no point in having a group of people on dialysis for whom there is no exit strategy. And that, of course, was transplantation. And by the end of 10 years, we started in 1967, and by 1977 we had done 1,000 transplants, which is not a bad kickstart. That was largely the responsibility of Michael Buick, who became our second transplant surgeon and who worked 28 hours a day on the program and was involved himself very personally in donor gathering. And as all the data have shown since, you just need very highly motivated people working full-time, talking to the families about donation. And Mick did that, and he succeeded. So we did a lot of transplants, and that included the children. But we were scared. We were scared of the criticism. I have a picture, I haven't got it here, of Vicky and her father. She was aged 10 and had reflux and was pretty well, but her father offered a kidney, and he was compatible, both in blood groups and the sort of tissue typing we were doing. We actually were doing quite good tissue typing very early, because Richard Batchelor, who was one of the pioneers of tissue typing, had worked for Peter Gora, who was one of the people who invented tissue typing. So we were already doing fairly sophisticated typing. But we thought, we warned them, and what both Vicky and her father, and of course we didn't know what the fate of the donors were going to be. Living donors had not been evaluated really long term. There were already data from the 50s, from the twin donors, for example, to show that most of them did pretty well. So we didn't feel too badly about that. But we were very much worried about the question of growth, and I mean growth in its largest sense, from social through to physical. And so we did the first grafts with trepidation, and found that they worked very well and that the children did grow. And we published, I've got papers downstairs that we proudly used to show with people on like that on dialysis and doing that on after transplantation. And from then on, really, the goal we had was to have no child on any more dialysis than we were on the outlook for a cadaver graft. We were looking for living donor grafts within the family. Our intention was basically to treat renal failure with transplantation rather than palliate it with dialysis. Because at that point, the enthusiasts like, say, Stanley, who's not here anymore to argue with me, he argued very effectively. Dialysis is palliation, it's palliative medicine, and should be classified under palliative medicine. And indeed, that is, I think, the attitude in many areas. And dialyzers, certainly adult people, dialyzing adults, now participate in palliative medicine. The thing that did worry us a lot was the effect of the doing all this to children on the families. But of course, in many cases, the families were pushing us very hard to do as much as we could, and indeed, in many cases, offered successfully or unsuccessfully, because we did believe in blood groups in those days. Nowadays, nobody pays any attention. But that's a long story. So some of the parents were pushing us to go faster. Others were being dragged into a whirlpool with which they couldn't cope. And I have good and bad memories, which in some ways I'd rather forget in some areas, of what happened. Some of the families were magnificent. One of the very early patients we had on dialysis was a little girl called Dora Wilson, who was a heroine. And I can remember, and even now it brings a lump in my throat when she died, eventually after enormous struggles. She was one of the very tiny children who had not grown, and her family were absolutely magnificent. They backed her up and they backed us up. And Dora was one of our early home dialysis patients, whom eventually we lost on dialysis. I have chosen to remember what she died of. But yeah, it was tough. And this is the reason that we didn't persist with home dialysis in children. Because it seemed to us we were going down the wrong channel. We could make it work, technically, but it was not good for the child, and it was not good especially for the family, and above all for the elder children. Where did we stand in all this? Could we turn to anyone for advice? Yes, the answer was we all clung to each other desperately like people in a raft in the middle of a choppy sea. In Europe, I think the largest group of children on dialysis in the late 60s was in Paris. Michel Boyer and Pierre Royer, who died later, not long afterwards, had set up a children's renal failure unit. And of course they had experience right back into the 50s of renal transplantation. So they had quite a lot of backup. I don't know, I'm afraid, when they started doing transplantation in Paris, but certainly they had children on dialysis on long-term dialysis in 1966. And in 1970 they presented a paper on a couple of dozen children. By that time we had about 1 dozen. So we were a lap behind, but trying hard. But there were very few other people who were doing it. There is a registry, or was a registry, already. I mean, one of the great things about the EDTA was it's recognized the need to record what we were doing in this very new field. And from 1970 onwards, there was a registry of the EDTA from before 19. And there was a pediatric supplement. And I know, for example, that there were 512, or was it 504, children on treatment for chronic renal failure in Europe in 1973. So data was being collected, and we used to wait for the annual report of the EDTA, both pediatric and adult, with bated breath. That was the thing, right? They started off the program always with that, and some people just went home at that point because they wanted to know what the benchmark was. What were other people achieving in terms of death rates, rehabilitation, and everything. So there was a good data collection. Cyril was on that later, on that committee, and it's still running today. I think that the technology for both dialysis and transplantation has changed completely
in the last 50 years. Obviously, it is so much easier and successful now. I mean, then it was complicated and difficult. I mean, for example, in the transplant program, we were using azathioprine and steroids following Tom Startzel's introduction in 1963 of that regime. We were still hunting for the right dose of azathioprine. I remember giving 8 milligrams per kilogram of azathioprine to patients. Rejection was almost inevitable in every patient. Every patient we would rate the kidneys in terms of their difficulty, in terms of how many rejection episodes they had, which we treated, of course, with bolus doses of high-dose prednisolone, methylprednisolone, sorry. And also, I mean, dialysis, I mean, the gear is so much easier to use now. We were working, as I said, with a great big clunky 3-meter long or 1.5 meter long, probably, dialyzer that you had to build. You had to make the kidney from scratch every time you did a dialysis. So that was a challenge both in the unit as well as in the home. Was one of the things that the parents had to tolerate was a dialysis unit being assembled with a sink suitable to take kidney, places for formalin, to store peritoneal dialysis fluid. We haven't mentioned peritoneal dialysis, but we were doing a lot of peritoneal dialysis at that time, but not chronically. We really felt that that was not a suitable technique. And of course CAPD, the equilibrium dialysis idea hadn't been mentioned. It only came in adults in 1972. So we weren't doing any PD in the 60s. Why didn't we do long-term PD? Well, of course, as I say, PD was different. We weren't doing equilibrium dialysis in the CAPD model with a few exchanges a day. We were doing in-out, 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 even hourly dialysis, which was quite impossible to do in the long term, which is one of the reasons why so few patients were put on chronic peritoneal dialysis at any age. Even the adult units, most of them didn't touch it. Very few people like Aureopolis in Canada did, but most people felt that it wasn't nearly as successful as hemodialysis. Peritonitis was a major problem. The connectology, again, was still evolving and was quite primitive. So I think with good reasons we didn't go into long-term PD. Once CAPD had come, of course that flipped, but again, Cyril can talk about that, I think, about using equilibrium rather than exchange dialysis in children, because that did move the goalposts hugely. For the 1967 meeting that Gavin and Harman Tiddens set up, it's what's not in the program that's significant, and that is there's nothing about dialysis or transplantation in children or acute or chronic renal failure, I think. I'm just saying that without having it in front of me. But it was about general nephrology, and of course we had a busy general nephrology unit treating particularly nephrotic children, which was one of the problems I was particularly interested in, but also anything that came our way. Because at that time paediatric nephrology was heavily into tubular disorders, often inherited. Pyelonephritis was a very big topic, how to manage children with renal failure, and how to pick out children with acute infections who had reflux, and from those that didn't, and those who had damage from their reflux and those that didn't. Remember, this was the world where virtually, I mean, ultrasound was just coming in, for example, just to give you some idea. So it was a different word technologically. But thanks to several pioneers, including Richard White, we did have biopsy evidence, and of course one must mention in the Parisians in this, interestingly, they were scared of doing needle biopsies. For a long time they did a small incision over the kidney and then did a needle biopsy of the kidney
after they'd revealed it. All of René Habib's early work was done on specimens obtained this way, which seemed to me to be having all the disadvantages of both an operation and a needle biopsy. Why they didn't take a wedge, I don't know. But, so, yeah, we had renal biopsy was being done by a lot of units in the States and in Europe, and including ourselves. But as I say, Richard was a pioneer in that area. And the three pathologists for the ISKDC, which I must mention at some point, were Jack Churg, who worked in New York and was originally from Lithuania. His family had walked all the way from Lithuania to Bremen to get on a boat to go to the United States in 1922. I learned from him. He was not a person who talked about his past, but I winkled that out of him with difficulty. René Habib in Paris, who was a fantastic person. I loved her very much and respected her enormously. And above all, we had so much fun together, arguing in public, sometimes for the sake of the audience, about all sorts of problems. And she was usually right in our arguments, and I was wrong. Like the nature of focal sclerosis, that was something we argued about back and forth in the bull rings of the various meetings for years. But she was a wonderful woman. I had the honour to give the introduction to her and Priscilla Kincaid-Smith when they received the Amberger Award of the ISN in Sydney in 1997. And when you look at her, what she had achieved, she was a Jewess from North Africa. She was a woman, a Jew, and came from North Africa. I don't think in the Paris of the 1950s, when she was trying to make her way through medicine and nephrology and make a career, I can't think of any heavier handicaps, and she got over them all and got absolutely to the top. And I think few people realise now just how enormous that achievement was. It's particularly important for female nephrologists, because there are a lot of paediatricians and a lot of paediatric nephrologists are women. And in René, they have a shining example of the breakthrough in medicine. Before then, it was all about men. But she was respected by everybody, and she was a tower of strength, and attended every one of the early ESPNs until her husband Elio, who was a lovely man too. He came from Tunisia, who gave her the name Habib. I just wanted to sidetrack from biopsies. You can't mention renal biopsy in children without bumping into René Habib somewhere. She said it all. And they published a book on paediatric nephrology from Paris in 1963 in French. It was never translated. It went to 3 editions, and it was never translated into English, which was a shame, because it's a very good book. I used it a lot. Paris, then, of course, with Amberger and other people, was one of the really big centres of medicine, of nephrology. And paediatric nephrology in Paris was similarly very good, and was in there very early in nearly everything. From dialysis, as we've already discussed, transplantation, which we haven't, and also in studies of glomerulonephritis, of course, with René. And because in Paris they got a huge number of patients referred to the children's unit at the Necker. And I visited there, so many times, and knew those people so well. And one of the things I should add to get on the record is that one of the things that I'm very proud of is, if you look up the programme of the very first ESPN meeting in Glasgow in 1967, number 1 on the thing is me, talking about neonatal nephrotic syndrome and looking at our protein clearance and biopsy results.
So I gave the first ever paper in the ESPN. So I'm proud of that. I'm going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the ESPN very shortly, and it's, I suppose, worth looking back at the first meeting in 1967 in Glasgow, where we'll be in September. I'm recording this in, May? Some of the story is in the article, which I hope everybody who looks at this is interested enough to read the history from Gavin O'Neill and his colleagues, including René Habib, incidentally, in Paediatric Nephrology in 2006. I think it appeared 2007, actually, in which the story is of the genesis of the ESPN. One has to go back a little earlier. I think it's in the role of the ISKDC, which I mentioned without explaining what it was, were the International Kidney Study for Kidney Disease in Children, which was a study of the nephrotic syndrome, which was run by Henry Barnett in the United States. Gavin had been to visit Henry Barnett in 1965 or 4, I think, and then Henry came to London and spent a sabbatical. And that opened a lot of people's eyes, because during his time in London, he convened meetings, small meetings, to start up the ISKDC. And from the ISKDC, in fact, grew all of the national and international societies. The ESPN, the ASPN. I don't know about the Japanese, but certainly the ISPN as well. So, and it was him. He was the driver of early nephrology, and somebody who realised that it needed some organisation, that people were trying to do things on their own, sometimes reinventing the wheel, and that it would be an enormous advantage if a group could meet with some regularity. And the Europeans got in, I think, a little before the Americans. I forget, I'd have to go and look. And Gavin O'Neill was the person who picked up the flag with Harman Tittins, who's sadly now dead. Gavin is still with us, and I hope, if his health permits, will be with us at the age of, I believe, 90. He'll be 96 by then. Will be with us in Glasgow. I very much hope so. We just heard the other day that he is willing and hoping to come. But he and Harman and Gavin was very fond of telling this story. Over a bottle of whiskey, of course, in Glasgow, decided to start the ESPN in 19... to forget names. I'm just looking at the programme in front of me, that's why I got my specs on, of the first meeting in 1967. It was a small group. There's a photograph of it, which maybe will be clipped into this, but it's in the paper in Paediatric Nephrology, and I'm just looking at it now. I think there were 70 people, something of that order. The program was over in 2 days, and the topics were neonatal nephrotic syndrome. René Habib talked about membranous. Mina Issing, protein metabolism in children with the nephrotic syndrome. Congenital and acquired nephrosis, osmotic resistance of erythrocytes. I don't remember that. That was Jussi Vilska, who was part of the unit in Finland that run by another person who was very prominent. I'm just looking down to see if he actually talked, but he didn't. And that is where are we? Another one of my names, Nilo Halman, who unfortunately died just the other year. Then it was more on nephrotic syndrome and treatment. Steroid resistance was discussed reasonably. Pyelonephritis was the next session.
together with urolithiasis, which was also another quite big topic. Hemolytic uremic syndrome, of course, Gasser described this in 1955, and we were still trying to understand it and separate the ones we now know to be due to inherited deficiencies in the complement control. But we had terrible problems with those to begin with because, of course, they didn't regain renal function very often. And they were transplanted, and of course they got recurrence of the disease in their transplants. And then we gave them another graft, and they recurred again. And then usually they died at some point on dialysis after that. And that was a real headache for decades. The non-infectious associated hemolytic uremics. Tubulopathies was the next group. And then a mixed thing with lupus in children. Chung Lam, who was another of the Glasgow team, recurrent hematuria and focal nephritis. And Ferdinand Demant of Czechoslovakia, who hosted the ESPN in Slovakia in 1973, up in the mountains, in a trade union hotel, which was interesting because, of course, going behind the Iron Curtain was quite an experience, which we did on a couple of occasions. I won't talk about that now. Talked about citrate metabolism, Ferdinand Demant. Then the final session, chaired by Nilu Halman, Ian Houston talked about hydrogen ion excretion and growth retardation. Tubular acidosis, Juan Soriano. Jim Dondon talked about phosphate and tubular reabsorption. Jim just died in January of this year, which is the age of about 98. Didn't make the ton. I was very sad to lose him. He was a great friend. I stayed in he had a cottage down in the west of Ireland, which I had the privilege to stay in. Henri Mathieu, again, one of the French team, Paris. And Anita Aperia, who's still around, bouncing around just as vivid as ever, I think. I met her in Paris in 2013 last, I think. Talked about tubular function in renal dysplasia. And then Henry Barnett gave a concluding guest lecture, Paediatric Nephrology, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that was the end of the first ESPN meeting. Doing research, of course, you've got to research the literature. And one of the lessons about doing that is that things get forgotten. Nowadays, as in the past, people do not read the old literature. And you've got to do a thorough search of what the origins of the ideas that you're playing with were. Because you'll miss things. I mean, there are examples of that all over medicine and surgery, but the one that is in my mind just at the moment is transplantation. Transplantation could have been done in 1920. It wasn't done until 1950, and even then people didn't use the information. It had been forgotten and lost because people just didn't look at the old literature. One of the problems, of course, at that time, right up until around 1960 and after, was that, of course, there were no computers, there was no Medline, there was the Index Medicus, which collected all the papers published in each year, which got bigger and bigger each year, until it was so many volumes for each year you couldn't even start. You had to go in the library, obviously, to look for it. You couldn't take it out. There was no photocopiers to photocopy it. I remember looking at the first photocopiers I saw in New York in 1962. So you had to write all your little notes during the lectures when people came on cards and put them in a little box at home. And everybody had one of those. God, you've got it so easy now. I just sit down and I go click, click, click. I log into Medline. Old Medline, you may not know, I hope you do, goes back to 1946. And you've got to search the literature from 1946 at least. If you have earlier than that, you have to start going to libraries or ask somebody in the library to help you.
but you should be looking at the past. Do a thorough literature search before you start your research. What would I say to somebody coming into paediatric nephrology today? Well, you're a member of a much bigger group with lots more going for you than it was when the ESPN started, for example. And looking after children is such a rewarding experience. It also is tragic and harrowing. I never, during the time that I was doing hands-on paediatric nephrology, I could never accommodate to losing children. I always regarded the loss of a child as a defeat. In the way an adult being taught that I must not do. I must accept it and plan for the decease. And I suppose sometimes in paediatrics one has to do the same. But I just found it very, very difficult to accommodate. And I think that makes it tough. You won't make a lot of money because private practice, if you wanted to go down that route, don't do paediatrics for a start. Pediatric nephrology isn't going to give you any money. If you want to spend a lot of time at home, well, it's at the cutting edge of acute medicine. You get a lot of ill people to see. But nowadays there are enough of you. I mean, there are unimaginably large numbers of people doing nephrology and even pediatric nephrology. I was just trying to find out a minute ago about how many pediatric nephrologists there were in Europe, for example, and I have no idea in the United States. But there must be hundreds and hundreds, compared with the handful of friends who used to gather together and drink and do fun things. In Finland, we went in the sauna, and I got pictures of people diving naked into the lake that I can't use. I suppose those days have gone. It's not. The meeting in Glasgow this year isn't going to be quite so much fun as the first meeting in Glasgow because of its size, and a lot of you won't know each other. But then, friends are strangers are just friends you haven't yet met. So you're a much bigger and more organised group. You can do so much more. You have so much more secure knowledge for everything from psychosocial development problems to the techniques of dialysis, to how to make sure you get glomeruli on your renal biopsies. And you should be able to contribute. Don't take everything that you meet in paediatric nephrology as a question. And you'll accumulate a lot of questions that you should be able to provide the answers to. Everybody should do research. Clinical research or lab research. I know there's now a division between heavy-duty laboratory research, where if you haven't got a PhD, you don't let you in the door, and clinical research, which is still hugely important. There are questions that we should be passing on to our colleagues and also investigating ourselves. Not lupus is a disease of young women, but why is lupus a disease of young women? We still don't know the answer to that after a century of trying to find out. Why do we get girls getting lupus many times more often than boys? Simple question. We see it every day in the clinic. Not every day, but often in the clinic. And we can do so much more for a disease like lupus today, and arthritis as well. It's another big advances. But we ought to be understanding a lot more. There's plenty to do. All the big questions have still not been answered. How do we stop the progression of glomerulonephritis? How do we edit out genes from the genome so we don't get inherited disorders? Why are the patterns of disease as we see them, say lupus, the way they are? You can help answer those questions. You're going to do that. You're the future. So please, please, think every time you see something and say that's a question, not a fact, and try and investigate it if you can. You'll have fun.